So, is everybody ready?
Not me.
Not you. There is a person down with an Amiga cursor T-shirt. He's there, but today he has another T-shirt on. So, hello. To this, I told before what is, of course, the topic of this talk. It's about emulation, and as we all know, emulation is the last thing we can do if there is no more hardware. And I can announce you had the perfect T-shirt for what you work for. And who has an Amiga Mini? So, okay. If you would have an Amiga Mini and you would have it in your hands, then inside Amiberry would be.
Yep.
Okay, so.
Hi. It's nice to see you here. My name is Dimitris. I am the author of a project I call Amiberry. And my idea for today was to give you an idea of what this thing is about, what you can do with it, what has been done with it, and hopefully trigger some questions from you guys also, and maybe ask around and see. Don't be afraid to ask whatever you're embarrassed to ask. It would be more interesting to get some feedback. So I think we'll start at the beginning because maybe not everybody knows what Amiberry is, so I thought I'm going to lay some groundwork. You probably have seen this device somewhere over the world. This is a Raspberry Pi, specifically the Raspberry Pi 2. And this is the reason Amiberry exists today. We have to take a trip back a few years, back in 2016. This was becoming very popular with emulators of all kinds because, of course, it's very affordable, easy to find. It's standard hardware, so there were no different combinations of hardware to worry about. And people started, the Raspberry Pi 1 was already available before that, but it wasn't very powerful. With the Pi 2, things started becoming a bit more interesting. And they became even more interesting as the Pi 3 came along and so on. So back at that time, I got interested in this device because I thought, wouldn't it be interesting to, I mean, this is a nice, cheap device that everybody could have, and our old hardware is, getting older. And many people in the world might be now at a certain age where they might used to have Amigas but don't have one anymore. And they might want to get back into it, but maybe it's very difficult to find the original hardware. It's very expensive, and it will still break down. So I wanted to give more options to the people, first of all, because I thought this is something I would like to have, and maybe somebody else will find it interesting as well. So the idea was, what if we can combine these two things, get the Raspberry Pi device, and get Amiga emulation into it, and that's how Amiberry was originally born. It wasn't a completely green field. It wasn't a do-from-scratch thing. There was, of course, UAE runs on pretty much everything. We know that. So there was a port of UAE for the Raspberry Pi already when I got started with this. And that's how it got me excited also. I thought, oh, we can actually do it today. Let's try that. And then I got really disappointed very quickly when I saw how broken it was. It was, unfortunately, based on a very old version of WinUAE, 2.8, if I'm not mistaken. It had a few bugs here and there, and it had a lot of things stripped down for the necessity, of course, on running on lower powered devices, but a lot of the features that I wanted to have also would be nice to have, and I wanted to make it better, in other words. I wanted to improve it. So I started getting involved in the project. This original port was maintained by another author. So my first, of course, reaction was, let's try to make it better, send him a pull request with some changes, especially when the Pi 3 came out. And I thought, great, now we can optimize it for the Pi 3, which is, I think it was 2 times faster maybe than the Pi 2. Let's do that. And then nothing happened. So hello, let's make a version for the Pi 3. Here you go, here are the changes needed. And I waited. A couple of weeks come by. 3 weeks, 4 weeks, nothing happened. So, typical. And this is how people like me, programmers, do things. They eventually end up making their own fork, which is, in other words, making a clone of that and let me work on it on myself, and then I just keep publishing the changes myself. So that's how it started. The first commit was in 2016. This is a history of the highlights on the history of Amiberry. We don't have to go through every line. This is not a business presentation. It's just for you. 2016 was the first commit that added Raspberry Pi 3 support. That's how this project started. Over the years, over time, it became so much more advanced than the original project that I thought it's better if it has its own name instead of mixing the two. So that's why it has the name Amiberry and not the original name. And then there was a continuous effort because in my mind, I didn't want to be tied only to the Raspberry Pi. That was the beginning, but I didn't want to be tied specifically to that platform. I wanted to be able to take advantage of other platforms that could be coming in the future, are already available at that time. There were a lot of things coming out during that time that were already faster than the Raspberry Pi. Things like, if you remember, the super failure of Asus Fingerboard. And not by hardware side. The hardware side was really impressive and fantastic, but there was zero support from software. So unfortunately, not a lot of things happened. But still, it was like 2-3 times faster than the Pi 3. So it was really exciting at that time to be able to run things on it. But in order to do that, the framework that this was built on had to be replaced. It was using STL1. STL1 had no hardware acceleration whatsoever. It worked on the Pi because it was also using an ancient, derelict, abandoned, obsolete backend that was called DiskManX, which was Raspberry Pi specific for display hardware. It was super fast, but it was already deprecated back then from the Raspberry Pi Foundation. So you knew the clock was ticking. This won't be the future. So I thought, OK, we need to move it to something else, like STL2, which is more multi-platform, hardware acceleration for hardware graphics and the GPUs and stuff. So that happened on September 2016. I started working on STL2. February 2017, then there was a new version with a lot of bug fixes and improvements and all. And it kept going on from then, as you can see. The code from WinUAE started to be merged in, so we updated it from 2.8 to 3.6 back in 2018. And then once we got to a rather interesting stable base, many of the big bugs at least were fixed. You never fix all the bugs. There was always going to be new bugs, but at least the major annoying bugs were fixed. Then we had a newer emulation core in there, so a lot of the accuracy was improved. We started thinking, I say we, but it's mostly me anyway. There have been people that contributed over the years. And it's fair to say we, especially about this feature, because this was implemented by someone else. Which was a great idea. You know, like in WinUAE, you have floppy disk images, which is great. You just emulate the real hardware. You insert a floppy disk image. You have configured your machine, your virtual Amiga somehow. Let's say you're emulating a 500 or a 1200, and it boots. That's fine, but then you also have 1200, and then you have games that support AGA, and games that wanted more RAM, and maybe CD32 as well. So it starts getting very complicated very quickly if you want to be really idiot-proof in the sense of, I just want to double-click this and it works. I don't want to configure all this stuff. So we thought, all right, especially if you have a front-end launcher like RetroPie, where you just show a bunch of games to the user, and they all want to just click on the game and just want to play the game. They don't want to fiddle around with emulator settings. We thought, OK, floppy disks are fine, but then you kind of need to know what configuration each one needs. But there's another nice feature that has been developed for Amigas, and that has been WHD load over the years, which is, for those that don't know it, it's a method of installing the floppy disk images onto a hard drive, which means no disk swapping and usually faster loading. And along the way, as a bonus, you also got some bugs fixed, some glitches that would be there on the original hardware. And yes, you can have a virtual Amiga put into a hard drive and then have these installed there. That was always a valid approach. But there has been another approach circulating back then, which was have each game packed on its own and in its own archive, an LHA archive specifically. What that allowed us to do, though, is handle them in a similar way as you would in a floppy image. So we thought, what if we could just feed the emulator the LHA file that has the WHD load files and the game inside it, and then have everything else done by the emulator? How would we do that? Well, first we have to know what the game is about, what kind of hardware it needs, and then we'd need to know what kind of settings or maybe tweaks it might benefit from, like maybe more RAM, or maybe this is a joystick game, maybe this is a mouse-based game, little things like that. So we started writing a central sort of repository. It is basically an XML file that contained entries for these games, unique entries for each one of them, containing their IDs, checksums for the actual LHA files, and then the best known settings for the emulator for them. And that grew and grew and grew to the point where we thought this is now useful. We can actually use this to detect the games you feed it and automatically configure the emulator for you. Well, to make a long story short, this allowed you to basically run the emulator, feed it an LHA file like you would a floppy disk, and let the rest be everything else done by the emulator itself. And it boots directly into your game. No disk swapping, no need to fiddle with the emulator settings and all that. And of course, nothing is perfect on the first try, so we also ensure there's a mechanism to get updates on this XML file from within the emulator, because there are new updates every 2 days on that file. I will show you how all of this works later, but for now I'm just giving you a rough idea. And it went on and on and on, reaching, fast forward a little bit to the more recent years where we've had 2022, we had a first version for macOS, in the same dream of expanding where this thing can run in more platforms. And we started with the Raspberry Pi, but it needs to be run everywhere. So Linux OS, Linux PCs can run it, of course. Mac OS couldn't run it since 2022. And later on in 2022, also, we had the first Flatpak version, which means it now runs on the Steam Deck and other distributions that use Flatpak. And moving forward further, last year there was a separation. The reason for that, the separation in the names. So Amiberry has become from one project essentially two different, very, very similar but different projects. One is called still Amiberry, and the other one is called Amiberry Lite. The reason for this distinction is that as WinUAE kept progressing, and I wanted to keep up with it, it reached the point with version 5, where Tony, the author of WinUAE, rewrote the chipset emulation code to be more accurate, which is great, but there's always a but in these things. It became 3 times slower. If I have a fast PC, like WinUAE is targeting Windows, as you know, it's fine, nobody even notices it. But if you run it on a Pi 3 or a Pi 4, it means that if it was running full speed just barely before, now it's just no way. It's not fast anymore. And then that sorely, I kept it as a post, a separate branch essentially for a while, keeping both things. I had one branch with the latest changes of WinUAE and one branch keeping up with the previous changes that were still fast enough for the Pi in the same repository, in the same project for a while, hoping that maybe this could be optimized somehow in the future. But the more things kept going forward, the more I saw this was not going to happen. It's actually becoming slower with new versions because it's improving accuracy more at the cost of performance. So at that point, I had to make a decision and say, okay, how do we move forward by keeping up with WinUAE, which we want to, but also keeping some sort of version for the performance that still runs on the Pi, at least the Pi 4, maybe. That made the split necessary. So Amiberry itself has currently the latest WinUAE version of the chipset emulation and everything else inside there, and all the latest features. And it's meant mostly for the more powerful systems like macOS, Linux PCs, anything faster than a Pi 5, essentially. And then there's Amiberry Lite, which is still going to be getting cherry-picked updates from the latest Amiberry, but not changing the core emulation that would break the performance. So it's kind of the best I could think of, at least. Right now, there have been new releases for both of them. These were done just a week ago. So these are their latest current versions. And there have been a shitload of changes in them, so it's way too many to list. But we can go ahead on the release page and see what has changed. It's way too many. Just a short version of the changes is that we now have packaged versions available. So for example, or if you're running Ubuntu or any other Debian or any other Linux distro, there's a deb package or an RPM package that you just install like any other package. If you're running a Steam Deck or anything similar, there's a Flatpak package that does it for you. And if you run macOS, there's a DMG image that you just get it extracted and install it like any normal macOS app, which is also notarized and signed with a proper certificate now, so macOS will not complain that, oh, this is insecure, I'll just delete it for you, which it does, by the way. Now, short list of versions. Yeah, I mentioned a few things already. I'm just going to mention that there are some unique features besides the WHT load support that have been developed specifically for Amiberry that, as far as I know, don't exist anywhere else at the moment. There was one that we kind of replicated what WinUAE was doing because it was Windows specific. That's this one, host run. The idea with that came from the author of AmiKit, where, if you're not aware, AmiKit is a distribution for WinUAE, a pre-installed sort of workbench with a lot of bells and whistles. And one of the features it had, since it was running on Windows, was taking advantage of a functionality of WinUAE that allows you to launch something on Windows from inside AmigaOS. So essentially, AmigaOS calls a hook on the emulator sends it to the operating system, and it launches something for you. But that used a very Windows-specific mechanism, so it couldn't be transferred over. So we kind of re-implemented that functionality in a way that can run everywhere else. Short version of that, I will show you later with some screenshots, but what you could do is, for instance, open up, with the command from inside AmigaOS, open up a browser, open up Chrome, for instance, and it will pop up in front of you. Or maybe send an MP3 file to be played in VLC, or an MP4 video or something. And that can be very transparent. You can also associate it with file types. So multi-view can open them directly, for instance. And it's like a hybrid solution between the operating systems, especially since we don't have a really good browser on AmigaOS, unfortunately. So this allows you to use the native ones. There have been also other interesting features. Yeah, sure, custom control mapping and RetroArch configs, on-screen keyboard. This one might be interesting for some of the people here having real floppy. Does anybody still have floppy disks around? There you go. Do you feel the need to copy those floppy disks, maybe immortalize them for the future, digitize them somehow? Well, now you can. Rob Smith, a great guy from the UK, came up with this idea of creating a project that not only a hardware solution, but also an open source library that allows you to connect with different controllers and floppy drives of today. So not necessarily Amiga floppy drives, but you can take a PC floppy drive, and even a USB laptop floppy drive, and hook it up to an emulator like Amiberry, and actually read the contents of your real disks. And also write them back, of course. So you can have an ADF and write it to a floppy disk, or you can do it the other way, read the floppy disk, write it to an ADF, or just extract the files you want from there, which is super useful for anybody having actual floppy disks today. Blah, 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 who cares, right? Some interesting projects for using Amiberry that you might not have heard of. I had a friend that he was always nuts with Lightwave since we met back in '96 or something. He was crazy with Lightwave, and he still is. He still has the original 1200 Amiga. He still has the original 060 machine rendering frames on Lightwave. So I told him, I'll save you from your misery and try to make something faster for you. Let's make a render farm using Amiberry, and let's say use Raspberry Pi. Since they're cheap, you can have many of them along the side. So we built. It started like a crazy idea that you talk about with your friend, in an afternoon, and it became an interesting project that I have documented in blog posts and details of how you do this. But the end result is that he still has his Amiga because he will never let go, of course, but now the Amiga can just lazily sit there giving jobs to the cluster of Raspberry Pis and, yeah, render that frame for me, will you? Sure, poof, there you go. Next one, and he can do that in parallel. So in this example, this was a test I made. I hooked up the Raspberry Pis I had at home, and this is remote desktop Intuit VNC, and that one on the top you can see as well. And they are just rendering frames for Lightwave at the same time in parallel. So you had a scene that, because he's crazy with it, of course, he would make scenes and animations of thousands of frames. And imagine if you need, on the real Amiga, I don't know, 20 minutes, 30 minutes per frame, it's a huge number of, I don't know, hours, days maybe? So this allowed him to create projects that would finish in a matter of hours, even if they were huge. And some of these projects actually took part in demo competitions and won first prize because he could make them and finish them on time. So it was really interesting for both of us to see this done. And he still uses it today. He's just upgraded his Raspberry Pis from 3 to 4, so they render a bit faster now. This is an example of host run and how you would use it. On the left side, you could see the well, maybe you can't because it's small. But if you had a magnifying glass on it, I can read it for you. The first command says host run Chromium browser. The result would be just open up Chromium here on the Raspberry Pi. And the second command is host run Chromium browser, and you give it a URL as well. And that opens up Chromium with a URL in it as well. So it's just a small example that launches the browser from within the shell of Amiga OS onto your screen directly. You can use it for any other thing that is accessible from the system, any command that you can access there, which also means it's a bit risky, and that's why this is behind an option if you want to allow it or not. Otherwise, you could nuke your system easily. AmiKit uses Amiberry. You may have heard of this. Is AmiKit running on an older version of AmiKit. This is 10. But there are also commercial products that use it, like we mentioned this one before. This uses an older version of Amiberry out of the box, 3.3, I think, or 3.4. A bit chopped up, modifications and all that from them. This also runs Amiberry, newer, more modern device, newer version of Amiberry as well. Did any of that get your attention? Do you want to know how you can get Amiberry today? Well, like I mentioned before, there are now ready packages, so it's way easier to install than it used to be. Back in the day, we had to manually install all the libraries you need to, and then download the zip file, extract it into work like a portable app, so everything had to be together in the same folder. If you really, really want to do it that way, you can still do it that way. There's still portable version support, but I think it's easier if you just have a deb package and just say sudo apt install that, poof, and everything comes with it. Versions are available on the first link up there. That's the official GitHub project page. And I will show you also the browser here. There's more links than these actually, but there's no room here to show everything. There's an Facebook Amiberry page. There's a Discord channel. There's a thread in EAB. There's a Blue Sky account you can follow. There's a Mastodon account you can follow. And there are also donations you can make on the Ko-fi link down there. Because as you probably know, open source developers get no money out of this anyway. We have no illusions about that. And this is the GitHub page that I mentioned before, which has the README. There's a very, very detailed wiki here that has a bunch of documentation about things, and it keeps getting updated almost every day. I just updated some things today in here, for instance, to hopefully make things easier on you on how do I do this or how do I do that. Explaining also each and every panel of the GUI here. So for instance, if you go to custom controls, you will see a screenshot of that and what you can do in here and explanations and so on. There will always be questions, and hopefully they will be coming up to the surface so we can make this better and not just kept under the seats and under the table. And the issues page here is when you can go and file a bug report, for instance, if you have something like that. Or maybe you have a question or such. There's also a discussions page here that you can come and open up a discussion like a thread. But like I said, there are other places you can do that if you prefer. EAB has a thread called under English Amiga board support. There's a support Amiberry now. So you can also go here if you prefer a normal forum. It's fine. I monitor everything. I have no life. Well, I try to sometimes. I don't know. Do you have any questions about anything? I've been talking for so long, I think.
First, we have to give you applause.
Oh, no.
Because we all profit from your work, huh?
Yes, this is all the profit I expect, anyway.
No, hopefully more. There is a donation you saw, huh? Where you can donate.
Yep.
So, are there some questions?
Yes, great. Finally, let's make it interesting. Fire away.
Thank you. It's really nice to meet you.
Thank you. Same.
Amiberry much. One question. I looked up. I didn't know it, but your program is GPL.
It's GPL3, yes.
These commercial products, did they send back the modifications or didn't they?
Let's say yes, and I can give you more details later. It wasn't always easy. Yes, but they did it all, yes, in the end. They have to. I made sure of that.
But it's not so easy that they...
It's not easy always, no. Sometimes you have to hunt them down and force them to do it, but yes, they did.
I think this is one of the big questions, if you make open source projects in GPL, that it's really that the people don't understand that it's, let's say, a collaborative project that is...
No, I think the problem is that many people think that, oh, it's free, it's open source, therefore it's free. I don't need a license. Well, it's a bit different because they don't understand that the GPL is a license. You have a license based on these terms, and the terms say that you can use it for free, but you're also obliged to do this, this, and this. Otherwise, you don't have a license.
Yeah.
And the same copyright law applies in that case as well.
Everybody is clear what GPL license says? Poof. Everybody? So you can't just use it and then do something and then make it...
The terms are, if you publish it again, you have to also publish your changes. You can take it, you can make whatever changes you want, and if you're just going to use it yourself, it's fine. But if you want to publish it again, you need to publish the same, with the same license, you need to publish your changes as well.
So the motivation design is also clear, or you do something for free and you get things for free too.
Yeah, any improvements or changes should also be with the same license.
Who is not using an emulation? You
Bad on you. Bad on you.
Yeah. No, I think there's always this big discussion with our students. We really have I'm in game design. We have really the problem that they try out games without knowing the real hardware and understanding that is something different. For example, if you have a Commodore 64 and they search the escape button. Is there an escape button from... no, there's no one. yeah, it's but things like this, sort of where you don't understand why this is how it is. Some other questions?
Is the Amiberry fast enough to run on the Raspberry 5, or is that not enough?
It's good that, thank you for asking that, because I wanted to mention it and I almost forgot. The Raspberry Pi 5 is the only device of the Raspberry Pi line so far that can run both versions at full speed. Below that, you need the light version. Above that, when the time comes, you can do whatever.
Thank you.
The Pi 5 is right at the edge.
Cool, thanks.
Yep.
So?
Come on, anybody with an interesting idea, any
really
weird project you have in mind?
This is
something?
a real problem of Swiss public, because they...
Don't be shy, come on.
They are shy, default is shy.
The more weird, the better.
Yeah, I would be interested in the history of, I mean, if it's fitting place, if you feel like talking about it a bit.
The history of the project itself?
The whole project, yeah.
Oh, sorry?
The history of the whole project.
Yes. Not sure what part of the history you want to know about, but like I said, it started on 2016, and since then it's been a slew of thousands of commits and changes over the years until today, and it keeps going on. It doesn't really end. It's just like a journey. There's no real destination. You just keep going, because there's always a way to make it better. And as long as I like the project and I get interesting feedback, I feel like more people actually like it as well, I keep doing it. If it stops being fun and it feels like a hassle, maybe it's better somebody else takes over. And that's why it's open source. I mean, everybody could fork it and make their own version of it, make it better. I always kind of expected that at some point, somebody better than me will come along and just say, you're doing bullshit, I'll just make it better for you. And then just, yes, finally. But that hasn't happened yet. Come on, you guys.
You are waiting. Is someone in here who wants to step into his...
Yeah, maybe the question was, why Amiga emulation?
Because I loved
else.
the Amigas, and I wanted to be able to use that memory and that nostalgia that I had about Amigas in a more accessible way, because I'm always afraid that the old hardware eventually will give up and there will be nowhere to replace it, and it will be a really sad day if you can't relive that moment anymore. It's probably useless for next generations unless they are investigating ancient technologies, you know. But for us, where we still have those memories and we want to relive them from time to time, I thought it would be useful to have a way of doing that without having to, you know, give an arm and a leg just to get the hardware and make it work, and then it breaks down again, and oh, then I need an 060 CPU, and those are really hard to find. They cost like hundreds of euros right now. And then they also break down eventually. What do you do then? So I thought we need to have an easy and accessible way of doing that without a lot of cost, and have all the features that we can pack into that. So I thought the Pi was a good opportunity to get started with that, and that's why I wanted to bring the Amiga emulation into that. And then, of course, it kind of expanded.
And the problem is you have only 2 legs. After you sold one and the other for the second Amiga,
you have to think about the rest management.
Exactly. But in those days, when you used the Amiga, for what you used the Amiga?
Well, originally, like I guess most of us, when we were at our teenage years, we used it for games. But then I realized that it can do so much more. Yeah. And I started getting into every little niche kind of capability I could find. So I used Soundtracker to write some music of my own because I could. I used Deluxe Paint to draw some poor artistic versions of things that I could think of. I used animation programs to create my own versions. Then I found out about Lightwave, and I thought, ooh, this is awesome. And I started seeing what companies back then were using in Hollywood for, where you had the Babylon 5 era, if you remember. And that inspired me to create 3D models, and I started learning how to do 3D modeling and all that. But of course, none of that became a professional occupation. It was just a hobby that I explored different versions of things that you can do with computers. And that led me to follow a professional route in computing as well. I'm a software developer now because of that, basically, because I found out that you can do so many things, and it's so interesting and exciting.
So Amiga was an eye-opener for you?
In many ways, yes.
Yeah.
The first computer I actually touched wasn't an Amiga, it was an Amstrad CPC, because those were really popular where I grew up, more popular than the C64, and that guy back there knows why. Ask him later. But in the whole country. But it was just for games when I saw that, and then I didn't even know the existence of the Amiga until one day at Christmas when I went to my cousin's place, and he had an Amiga 500.
Yeah.
And by that time, I was ready to just go buy an Amstrad, you know, just have one for myself. 8-bit, green screen, soft synth sounds, all of that package. It was fantastic to my eyes. And all of a sudden then, I remember I saw 3 things. Test Drive 2, the Dual, Falcon, and Soundtracker playing Bad Criminal from Michael Jackson, you know, with the sampled sounds. And I was like, this thing exists? It's real? It's not sci-fi?
Yeah.
And of course, that changed everything from then on.
Today, because this is always this big discussion with people who develop emulation, do you use your emulated Amiga at all?
I use it. The question is, what do you use it for?
The project creating emulators is more important than the rest.
In some ways, I mostly use it to make sure it works than actually do something with it.
Okay.
But there are real use scenarios also from time to time. For example, when I have a clone, I also have it here, but we don't have to spend all the time showing it now. You can find me later if you want. I have a clone of my real 4000 setup. In Amiberry, that it's much faster to do things in emulation instead of the real hardware, if you especially want to test something, and then maybe do it on the real hardware. I also keep backups from time to time. It's much faster to just drag out the CF card, put it on the emulator, do the changes, whatever, or an upgrade of something, and then put it back. So I use it for things like that, like sort of maintenance, if you want.
Okay.
And also when I develop software, I made a recently is relative, what was it, 2 years ago? I made Amidon, a project that is a Mastodon client for the Amiga.
Yeah.
So I developed that in the emulation because it was faster to test with, but then I had to go and test it on the real thing as well, make sure it works.
For me, emulation is also important if I develop at the moment also another Amiga game. And without emulation, yes, I wouldn't do this because...
It's punishing yourself for no reason.
Exactly. Even I like the Amiga keyboard. I don't like the mouse, to be honest.
No, I'm
Here
not ashamed to say that I prefer my nice mechanical keyboard. Thank you very much.
Okay. Yeah, no.
If you're typing.
Exactly. So, last question. Who hates the Amiga?
Yes,
Who
come out
loves
now.
the Amiga?
Forever be silent.
Yay! Okay. So, with people with him, we go another 20 years Amiga history.
Hopefully.
Thank you.
If we're
And
still
he's down there on the...
Down there where the Amiga,
with the Amiga board.
lights are. You can find me there.
Thank you again.
Thank you.
A big applause. And I think this is also the last talk, or? If I'm right. No. So thank you that you were at the Vintage Computer Festival. And I think it's important that we also have in mind that technology and the usage of technology is part of culture and not something else. Or? So have a good evening and a good rest of the festival. Bye.